Now let's have a look at the other instrument selections within this release. And here we're going to look at the pianos, we're going to look at the synths, the playable guitar patches, and this fantastic brass section that was created specifically for this release. Now let's first off have a look at the main piano sound. This is the F9 Disco Grand. And it was actually my dear friend, the bass player Guy Pratt, that gave me the idea for this patch. He talked in his productions in the past of using stereo pianos, in other words, two piano sounds panned quite wide. And that's exactly what we have here, a fully resampled piano patch made up of two pianos, one panned left, one panned right, and carefully put together to make sure that the stereo image is both wide but still cohesive. And I was absolutely shocked when I heard this actually in action for the first time. It's fantastic. What a brilliant idea. The width of the piano means that it will cut through on even the busiest drum production and also stay out of the way of your more central instruments. There are two variations of this style of patch within the library. You've got Disco Grand and Disco Grand 2. There is another acoustic piano here that is deliberately lo-fi. It's called 70s tape piano. It's been through an old Revox tape machine, and we've deliberately pushed the noise floor on it, as you'll hear in the decay portions. So moving on to the electric pianos, there's a patch here that I'm really proud of called Neo Piano. This is a very carefully multi-sampled electric piano patch that has gone through a classic vintage phaser in mono first and then through a stereo emulation of the Roland CE1. Now, if any of you have ever watched Matt Johnson's amazing YouTube channel, please jump onto it and subscribe. It's fantastic. What a player and what a sound designer. You'll see him often using the old Roland CE1 pedal in conjunction with an electric piano. Now, that pedal actually outputs in mono, so we use the stereo recreation and then sampled it in round robin, so each time you're hitting the key, you're getting a slightly different phase of the chorus. And it's carefully under control with some EQ to make sure there's not too many bottom frequencies in there so that it won't get in the way of your bass instruments. We've got two other electric piano sounds that are based on the Wurlitzer Reed pianos, but have also gone through some similar swirly processing. Here is both of those patches in action on the Republic session. And I've also layered the Neo piano with that on this actual production. And you can see visually from the regions at the top there that they're playing slightly different parts. And this is completely deliberate. And we're going to take the same kind of principle that we took with the claps. In other words, we have one pass that is completely quantized. And as you can see here, this bit, when I dig in, it's right on the bar line. But then another part that's playing from a different instrument is deliberately off-grid. It's deliberately doing different things and almost falling into some of the chords. Now, you'd think that by doing this, all of these little different timing variations across different parts playing effectively the same chords would cause all sorts of problems, that it would be a bit of a mess. But in fact, when it's this type of sound, this big, warm, swirly thing, it can just add to its gloriousness. But one little trick I really want to show you, because this is great fun if you're inside of Logic. So I've got this nicely quantized, and I'm just going to flip down this more triangle here, and there's one parameter that you may have never used, and that is Q Flam. So I've just zoomed in a little bit, and you see at the moment all of the chords happen exactly on the bar line. Now watch what happens when I turn up the Q Flam. You see that? It actually starts spreading them in terms of timing. And that can get really pronounced as well. Or just incredibly quick, just really slight. And all of these ways of moving things slightly off the grid will just add warmth to certain sounds like this. Now, also consider different types of sonics for sounds, because a little bit of contrast within your production can really go a long way. So in this section, I'm using the Whirly Keys and this brilliant little patch I got out of my trusty JX8P. And that was sampled with some deliberate wow and flutter onto it. But then we move into a separate section where some more digital sounds come into play. So in that little bridge section, there's quite a few interesting techniques going on. First of all, I've got this metallic sound that's off a JX8P, and it's using the Xmod function on it. Got this wonderful wide patch from a Prophet 5. A lo-fi patch from an OBX. And also a few little notes from an old Yamaha PSS keyboard. It's a 2-operator FM synth that's built into this kind of completely generic home keyboard, but it's got a MIDI input, so I was able to sample it quite easily. So that gives us a real melting pot of sounds to kind of work together there. And the juxtaposition between those slightly more metallic sounds and the warmth of the analog and the lo-fi-ness of those cheap keys allows us a really interesting palette of sounds just for this one section. One thing I completely forgot to mention when we were looking at the basses is this wonderful little sound. That is actually an arpeggiated 808. Now, normally 808s have a great big long release and they go on forever. I'm actually using the same patch here. But to get that full, I'm actually just holding down a chord, and I've got an arpeggiator that's on a downward function, and it's actually going over a 4-octave range, and the notes are fairly short. A great little trick for getting these kind of effects. And it's actually on 30-second dotted notes. So in other words, it's not on a straight grid, it's on a completely shuffled grid. And that's why you get this wonderful fall into the next section. And now I want to talk about the fantastic brass section in this release. I'm using 3 of the brass patches here. We've got the top horn staccato, in other words, short notes. Let me just show you what they are. The second patch here is marked FSZ, and that's short for sforzando, which means play with a sudden accent. And basically this patch, you'll get a burst of energy at the front, then it will quickly die down and become softer and then rise back up. And it's an effect you've heard tons of times in brass. And on the bottom on this production, we've got some saxes. Oh, pardon me, better play a bit higher. Let me just play you those in solo and then in the context of the track. And I'm sure you can hear that the actual tonal quality of these has been deliberately pushed forward to make them very retro, very punchy, and also to complement each other and not get in the way. I think something that's often missing in a lot of multi-sample brass patches that I come across. And the emphasis whilst we were creating these patches is completely on vibe. I wasn't too worried, particularly on the saxes. They're a little bit loose sometimes. But they've got that growl. They've got that sound that fits in with this genre of music, and that's exactly what you need. Let me play you these in full operation within the track. Now, there's a couple of tips that I'm going to give you for putting sections like this together. First of all, sing the part in your head. Don't just try to work it out on the keyboard, because that's pretty much, in my opinion, how the arrangers of the day might actually function. The other thing, a little trick here, is to layer these staccato horns together with the sforzando, because even though the sforzando is lovely for these, they've also got the sharp attack at the front, so you can really play staccato lines with them. Layer a sforzando pass like that with the top horns and you'll get excellent bite. But also, I would say it's about how you put the information in. Now, I love octave spread brass parts, so in other words, 2 octaves playing the same thing. But when you get into the MIDI here, you can see that there's timing variations between the upper octave here and the lower. Look, they're just slightly off grid from each other, and that's because I recorded it as 2 separate passes of MIDI information. Now, what that will do is just slightly emulate the live feel of 2 players playing together. They're always going to be slightly out of time with one another, and that's an easy way to emulate it. Now, also, if you really want to push the boat out, duplicate the patch and actually detune the second pass slightly when you actually play it in. Only needs to be a couple of cents. There's a very good reason why you might want to try that. No 2 trumpets are the same. They are generally made by hand. And also the players will treat them differently. They will tune them slightly differently themselves, and they will play differently. So emulating any kind of realism like that will get you a more authentic sound. Shorter notes in disco brass lines always work really well, unless you want one of those slightly longer sweeps. But let me just play you back what we've got here. Also, make sure that the release of the amp envelope is really tight. That will really bring forward the staccato nature of the parts. Okay, let's dive into the San Francisco project and listen to the brass lines on this. We're using a similar technique here. We're doubling up the sforzando with the staccato patches. Let me just play you that very last section there, and we'll zoom in a bit to have a look at the MIDI. So have a look at this note here. It's an A sharp that is spread between 3 Gs. Now, the Gs here are actually the final note of this little melodic sequence, and we've just popped that A sharp on top. And it sounds great. Why does it sound great? Well, it's actually a minor third above the G. So we're effectively adding a chord at that point. We're just not playing the last note of a G minor triad, which is D. And for some reason, adding thirds like that, particularly on the minors, sounds really, really good on brass. Obviously, it needs to be in key. So if you know where the minors are within the key that you're working in or the mode that you're working in, see if you can pop those thirds on every now and again. And I would also say use them sparingly and as accents like this. They will get you a brilliant result. There's one patch I quickly want to show you here. It's called Bones Staccato. What's bones? Short for trombone. Obviously, being a much larger brass instrument, it's got its own tone to it that really works well on these staccato parts. So layering some of these patches up will get you an awesome sound. One of the things I really wanted to do in this pack was bring together some fusion instruments, bringing some new techniques into the kind of classic sampling, and I'm really pleased of this patch called Soul Pluck. Let me just solo what it's doing here. Now, this is a real mongrel of a patch. It's a whole series of sounds from electric instruments, including keyboards and guitars, layered up together and very carefully processed with some nice lo-fi. Now, you're hearing a load of EQ and processing here that we set up specifically for the riff that's in this production. So let me just put it back to its vanilla state a minute, and you can hear the power on the lower keys. And there's the change at the top. But there's something else very unique about this patch. This is the first F9 patch that we've used binaural processing on. So it has a much wider and much more 3D stereo image to it. And this is something that we're going to really concentrate in the coming years, because we've discovered that having multi-sampled patches with binaural processing applied at source is fantastic for creating depth in a production. Now, whilst we're on this project called Ritual, let me just play you the main drop. Now, in my opinion, you can pretty much gather up every type of sound you might put in a production and split them straight down the middle. There are two separate camps. On one side, you have sounds that decay, whether that be quickly or slowly, and on the other side, sounds that sustain. So on this one, for example, we've got our Soul Pluck still kicking away in the chorus. It's been pulled down a little bit, but it's still there. So that's keeping a degree of movement and continuity from the verse section. We're accenting bits with a pick guitar part. And this is one of the two main guitar patches that was sampled from my trusty 339 guitar. It's a hollow body guitar. It's got a little bit more weight than the electrics like the Strats, and I find it ever so useful in these playable patches. Now, the second half of this, we're using the Mutate pick guitar patch. Now, this is a picked guitar multi-sample patch that has been put through a little bit of chorus and an analog filter with envelope triggering on it. It's excellent to play. So across that backdrop of the rhythmic sounds, we've got our sustain sounds. And here I'm using a polysynth called Metal Poly and a guitar patch that is actually created via physical modeling and then reamping. Let me just play you that synth guitar by itself. Now, later on, to warm things up, we bring in the Neo piano. And this quite lo-fi sound called OBX C90. So by adding layers like that, we're just increasing the chordal interest. Let me show you what I mean. We'll just come back a little bit here. And for me, the key to a great disco record is that mixture between the short, sharp, funky staccato patterns that are keeping the energy and making your foot tap, and these more sustained sounds that are actually bringing the rich music together. Get that right, and it's dynamite. Now, the bass you're hearing grinding away on this track is a mixture of these two patches. The Kelly bass that is multi-sampled from an OBX-A, and the blindside bass that is multi-sampled from a collection of Eurorack modules that was set up with a completely stereo workflow, so dual oscillators into dual filters, dual VCAs, etc. Now, here's a tip about layering synth basses. You always want there to be quite a big difference between the sounds. Now, even these are both synth-based, the tuning of the oscillators is quite different. So on this one, it's nice and tight. It may be wide, but its oscillator tuning is very tight. It's very close. But have a listen to this one. You can hear the oscillators are quite detuned against each other from one side to the other, and that's why they can add together particularly successfully. And now for the final part of this walkthrough and tutorial, let's have a look at the synths. And as you can see, we've got quite a lot of them. This is a few of the polysynths in action in the project called Munich. And the wonderful thing about the post-disco era, as these synthesizers started to come into play, was that it was no holds barred. None of these sounds had really been heard before in nightclubs, and the gloves were off. Let me just take you back to this beginning section that I played you a minute ago. And why does that sound so good? Well, basically, you've got a big fat polysynth that's been multi-sampled from a Juno, and I'm doing basically a keyboard wipe. Now, here it is as a MIDI part, and as you can see, it's almost quite chaotic, but it was played in live. The only thing I did is quantize that actual main chord bang on the beat, but that's why it's got this really rich feel to it. And the great thing is, no matter what your keyboard skills, you can play it. However, let me now show you a quick little trick. What I always do to get these is actually record the wipe on a separate channel to the chord. So in other words, you get the chord going first, and then you record the wipe. Now, did you spot my deliberate mistake? Record quantize is on. If you quantize the stuff as it's coming in, you'll never get the pure wipe. So in Logic, we can take it off afterwards. If you're in another DAW that records as it's going in, like Ableton, for example, and you've got it turned on, make sure it's off. And the great thing is now I can just slip it about until I'm happy, and then just glue the parts together. So a great trick for all of these kind of wiping and fairly mad effects. Also, always investigate the mod wheel on patches like this, because 9 times out of 10, like all of the sounds in this collection, it's going to be sending an LFO to the pitch of the patch. Hear that extra wobble as I turn it up? Here it is without. Here it is with. And I must admit, I love all these big brash 80s brass sounds. Here's another one. It's called Disco Poly. And one of my favorites, Yacht Brass. A lot of 80s polysynths often had clavinet patches in there, the more reedy sound of pulse waves, perfect at emulating them. Here I'm using one multi-sampled from a JX8P as a rhythmic instrument, and you'll see I've also included some mod wheel information. So Don't forget, synthesizers can always replace rhythm guitar parts on productions such as this. There's a couple of bread and butter sounds I just want to play here. Robot Funk and P5 Force 5. So once again, I'm using that concept of sounds that decay on top of sounds that sustain. So here's the staccato sounds all together. And two fantastic leads multi-sampled from a Prophet 5. And one piece of advice I would give any wannabe synth programmer out there for this style of music, it's all about modulation. Sending LFOs out to pitch, a little bit to filter, maybe even wave shape, and then sticking a great big slab of stereo chorus on the top, and you are on your way to greatness. Another great tip I can give you, select your pitch bend amount if you can within your synth or sampler so it's at high value. So in other words, this the pitch bend wheel will bend this patch down by 2 octaves. And I'm using that setting to great effect on this little falling synth line. It's only one note, but it's got a progressive pitch bend drop across it. I can't tell you how useful these kind of things can actually be. I'm also doing the same with this patch called Hydrogen Synth. Sounds like Han Solo's motorbike, doesn't it? Extreme pitch bend values like that are really good on synth leads, and here's a perfect example from the project San Francisco. It's just one straight note, but also I've got some pitch bend information here that was played in live, and you can see it's just bending the note down. And they can be incredibly useful for just adding an extra layer of expressiveness on a top solo line such as this. Now, one little trick for helping out with lead lines like this, particularly if you're drawing them in on the piano roll, you may be tempted to extend the note right out like that, but if you cut it short a little bit, then it's totally feasible to be able to get the pitch bend right back up to 0 again, so it's nice and safe for the next line. But obviously, having a high pitch bend range is also ever so useful for climbers. Listen to this in solo. Now, I've also added some automation there, increasing the delay amount, and that's a parallel delay circuit inside of this rack. So in other words, the delay comes in without actually detracting from the original sound, which is why you get that lovely spread at the end. But the great thing about this is you can select the note that you're rising to, and if it's within the key, one of the principles like maybe the root or the fifth, then you get these excellent musical rising effects that are totally in key with your track. And once again, I've got to say, stacking is the order of the day. We've got a couple of the poly brass sounds here. Here's the Juno Classic sound, or Juno Class patch. And here is the Yacht Brass, quite a different sounding, a little bit more of a brassy patch. So not only do they have different oscillator profiles, they have quite different chorus profiles on top. And when you stack them, it just gets huge. And then bring that in with the other instruments that we've talked about before, the Disco Grand and the Neo Piano. Now, one sound I quickly must play you is this sync lead sound from a Prophet inside the project Stockholm. It's this kind of tearing sound that goes exactly against the bass. Let me play it to you with the bass parts as well. And we've used it right at the end of the track as well, where all of the music changes. I always find those metallic edge sounds cut really nicely against the warmth of analog style patches. So to round this video off, I thought I'd put together a quick little production to show you how some of these synth sounds work so well together. See how many of the techniques that we've discussed already you can hear in this little piece. So that's it for this video, but please don't forget to check out the rest of the video series for F9 TRAX Electric Disco 2, where we go through everything, not only the production techniques and all the tricks we learnt there, not only the sound sources, but also the musical theory and the mixing of modern disco. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you soon.